All right,
Uh,
so we're here with Brian Booth Craig, one of my personal favorite sculptors, talking about his work. We've been going back and forth via email for a couple weeks now, going over some stuff. And you were just telling me about your studio. So why don't we go into that a little bit? What your studio space is like and where you do your work?
sure. I live about 70 miles west of New York City, directly west of New York City,
Mhm.
near the Delaware River and on the Pennsylvania side. And I have a small farm here, about 9 acres. And on that farm, I have a couple of studio buildings. One of them is new. It's a big studio building where I'll be able to run courses, teach workshops, host workshops, that sort of thing. Also has living quarters so that I can have apprentices stay there. And I'll probably start doing apprentices this fall, coming up soon. I'll have somebody coming for 3 months to apprentice with me. And then, in addition to that building, I have my old studio building, which is in an old barn, sort of a 19th century barn, partially converted. And I have a workshop in there for doing bronze work, all kinds of equipment, welders and grinders and
Mhm.
sandblasting equipment, woodworking equipment, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
The, nut, the nuts and bolts of production for sculpture I have in that building. So, and I also have an additional studio there for assistants, apprentices, that sort of thing, where they can work. So I have multiple spaces on this property, and
Mhm.
it's a multi-use one. And my plan eventually is to expand upon this and add additional spaces for resident artists to come out, stay for a short period, do some artwork, and take advantage of this location. It's a really beautiful spot. If I knew I could keep my Wi-Fi connection, I could walk you outside and show you. I think I might lose you.
Yeah.
So my website has some photos of the spot that I'm on, and people can
Nice.
go check that out. But yeah, so it's a great spot. It's really beautiful. It's not too far from New York. I can get into New York within an hour and a half or less, and I'm directly north of Philadelphia, where you're located,
Yep.
about 2 hours. So that gives you an idea of where I am. And
Yeah.
uh, primarily, I moved out here because New York just became too expensive, particularly for the kind of space that I required to do my work and equipment that was needed to do
Yeah.
bronze, that sort of thing. So
Mm.
uh, that's how I ended up here.
Yeah. It's
It's,
expensive
it's
just to exist in New York.
yeah, exactly. There are too many places within this vicinity of New York that are also affordable. This may
Yeah.
be one of the last areas that kind of fits that definition. But anyway, that's where I am. That's my studio situation.
Mhm. So one of the things that I found interesting in the tech stuff that you sent me was that during college and stuff, you didn't really work in the representational style that you do now, or even working in sculpture at all. So you kind of fell into it. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I went to university, and the art program at that time was highly non-representational. Basically, there was a lot of theory, a lot of process-based art. I mean, it's a good program for all of that. I received a good education, a good general education,
Yeah.
but there really wasn't any kind of representational work being done or being taught at the school. There was one figure drawing class which I took, of course, and pretty much everything else was on your own if you wanted to do that sort of work. So, I when I was in undergraduate school, I started to become interested in representational sculpture in particular.
Yeah.
But there weren't too many people to look at that time. There were a few. There were a few that were doing it. I was looking at Louise Bourgeois. I was looking at Robert Graham. I was looking at then of course older works as well. And then I just wanted to try my hand at it, and I
Yeah.
found that I had a knack for it. So I was pretty much self-taught at that point. I was just
Yeah.
hiring models, other students usually the art students oftentimes other models that or other students that needed to make money, so I hired them to model for me, and that's how I got
Yeah.
started. Really, it was, and I wasn't really discouraged by the university
Hmm.
or the program director when I started exploring that.
Yeah.
So, but it was very self-directed. At that time, and even now today, there aren't a lot of programs that offer skill representational education. So anatomy and that sort of thing. But that was so it was a very, in fact, all of my work from that period was abstract and process based.
Yeah. So working with models and doing that, I have experience in like painting and drawing, but what's that like sculpting? I mean, sculpting is such a long process.
Right. Yeah. So when you're for sculpting, of course, it tends to be a little bit more intensive in terms of the hours that people put in. I tend to work pretty fast though when I'm with models, and a lot of that is due to the fact that I just had to work fast because of the money involved. Because when you're hiring models, it becomes quite expensive. Now, I do very often work with models that are friends or somebody that maybe I'm with. They'll model for me. But typically I hire models, and so it can become very expensive very quickly.
Yeah.
And so I became quite efficient at it. But you're right; it is a more intensive process working from models when you're sculpting because it's just the material process takes more time.
Yeah.
But otherwise it's the same. I mean, there are certain key differences when sculpting versus drawing or painting. So if you're drawing or painting from a model, typically you set up the model with particular conditions, right? The lighting conditions, the position that they're in, and you mark those conditions and you try to recreate them every time you have a session with the model, right? Whereas sculpture, you're constantly moving around, you're changing the lighting conditions, you're trying to see things from different points of view, not a singular point of view. And so procedurally, it's a little bit different in that regard as well. Just because you need to be constantly, it's three-dimensional, so you need to be seeing from multiple points of view, and then trying to synthesize that information from those different points of view into a singular vision of a three-dimensional object in your mind. So it's really, and that's one reason I don't like working from photographs, because photographs are a really inefficient way to gather three-dimensional information, and I prefer to work from light for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about scale, and you said your preferred scale is life size. Now, does scale come into play at all with the mediums you're using, or does that just kind of vary piece to piece?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it does vary piece to piece. I really do prefer life size, just because the physical impact of it when you're looking at the piece in the space, it tends to have a lot more presence to it. Unfortunately, I do most of my work in bronze, and bronze is quite expensive, particularly when you get up to scale. So typically, I will do things at a smaller scale, about half scale, and then if it's something that seems like it could be enlarged because it would be something that people would want, then I can enlarge it from a smaller scale piece. Even though my preferred scale is life size, I really do most of my work at about half scale or half height. Simply for, like you said, for material reasons, or for material reasons, because it's a quite intensive process. So, I tend to, like I said, I tend to sculpt pretty quickly from the model when I'm in the studio, and so, at that scale, I can generate a lot more ideas. But very often, I'll do a piece quarter scale or half scale, and in my head, I'm thinking that it's going to be life size. Which is probably why a lot of people, when they see my work online, they think it's life size. It's a little confusing in terms of the scale of a piece in a photograph, because I am modeling with that thought in mind for the future. But in terms of the ideas, generally the scale wouldn't really matter so much. I mean, any of the pieces that I have could be scaled up or down. I don't think that they're specific. The ideas are necessarily specific to the scale that they're in, right? They could be various scales. And I think that life size just has more impact. It's a more uncanny type of object, because it relates to us one to one when it's life size, and that's why I like it. That's why it has a frisson to it that's really unique. To that particular that particular thing. So Does that answer that question? I know it's a very
Yeah.
yeah,
So when you're sculpting with the model, you're working in clay, correct?
correct. Yep,
And and then you're progressing into a mold and wax and
correct,
then casting from there.
correct,
Um,
correct.
so tell me a little bit about that process. I get the general idea, but not the ins and outs necessarily.
Right. Well, you said it pretty well, actually.
Yeah.
You described it in the basic fashion for people who don't know. Um, yeah, you start with the original pattern is in clay. I use mostly plastiline,
Mhm.
oil-based clay,
Yeah.
and the primary reason I do that is for the sake of efficiency, because I oftentimes have up to 10 projects, anywhere from 3 to 10 projects going at once in my studio,
Yeah.
and water clay tends to dry out, and so you have to keep it moist. And I travel a lot, I do other things, so the oil-based clay, you don't have to maintain it, so it's a little more efficient. In
Yeah.
addition, when I do very small scale things, it's much easier to use plastiline because small details like fingers or ears don't dry out and crack off.
Yeah.
So I use plastiline, but you could use water clay. Okay, so
Yeah.
the original piece is the original pattern is done in a malleable medium like water-based clay or wax or plastiline, and from that a mold is made. I do primarily silicon rubber molds,
Okay.
and silicon rubber mold is a negative of the
Yeah.
original, which is a positive. Into that negative, you can pour multiple types of materials. In my case, because I'm doing bronze, you have to pour an intermediate material, which is wax. And the wax is a hollow wax. And that hollow wax, you then make another mold over out of, in contemporary materials, a ceramic shell. You make
Right.
another mold over that. I'm kind of simplifying this for the sake of the viewer, but
Yeah.
you make a mold over that. And then the wax is melted out. So the wax is lost. That's why it's called lost wax casting.
Okay.
Because the wax is vacated from that second mold,
Mhm.
and wherever the wax was, wherever it was vacated, the bronze goes into that.
Yeah.
So you have three positives and two negatives when you're doing bronze casting from a clay original.
Yeah.
You have the clay original, which is a positive. You have the first mold, which is negative. You have the wax, which is a positive. You have the ceramic shell mold, which is negative, and then you have a positive with the bronze.
Yeah.
So it's an extremely labor-intensive process,
Yeah.
going from clay to bronze.
Mhm.
Um, and by the way, also most pieces, particularly when you get above a small scale,
Yeah.
most pieces are cast in multiple sections.
That was what I
So
wanted to
that
ask about next.
right. So those sections then have to be fitted. They usually are distorted a little bit in the final bronze, so you have to bend them out to make them fit again. And
Mhm.
then once fitted, you weld them together, and then all of the weld seams where the pieces were fitted together, those have to be removed, which is called chasing,
Mhm.
and that's primarily with die grinding, pneumatic die grinding tools.
Mhm.
So I do some of the work by hand with files and chisels, but
Yeah.
these are, so then you have to chase all of those seams and make it look seamless.
Yeah.
And if you've done that, then you can apply the patina.
Okay.
Um, so in terms of man hours, there's significantly more man hours in the production, the casting, than in the sculpting.
Yeah.
Significantly.
Yeah.
Um, if you add up all the people involved and all the work that goes into it,
Yeah.
which is what drives the cost up.
Yeah. Exactly. That was one thing I wanted to ask about because working primarily in steel, for my work, I know how much of a pain it can be to buff weld and especially make them seamless. So, are you going in and sculpting out any details to make that seam cleaner?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, sometimes, that's a tricky thing because sometimes on a very small piece, when you're
Yeah.
welding together, you're actually eliminating some details that you then have to, in a sense, you have to resculpt into the bronze.
Mhm.
Now, bronze is a much more malleable material than steel.
Yeah.
So you can really carve into it. In fact, the word chasing to me it comes from the French for carving,
Oh, okay.
because that's the way people used to do it. They used to use chisels to clean up the surface, um, but yeah, you do sometimes lose some details that then have to be reapplied into the bronze,
Yeah.
which is why each bronze ends up being slightly different. I mean, not significantly, but each one's slightly different in the addition,
Mhm.
and And it's also why I like to do a lot of the work myself, or in my studio with studio assistants, so that I have control over those details from the original all the way to the finished bronze.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's not easy to do. It takes a particular skill, weighing it and chasing it and making sure you don't lose anything, that's important.
Yeah.
And actually, the truth is that the most difficult part of bronze casting, especially when you get to a larger scale, is distortion that happens in the bronze because whenever you pour your wax is going into the mold liquid, okay?
Yeah.
And when a material cools and solidifies, it shrinks, right?
Yeah.
So the liquid turns to a solid, it shrinks a little bit, and so whenever things shrink, they can distort.
Yeah.
And then when, of course, you make the bronze, you're doing the same thing. You're pouring liquid metal into the mold. As that's cooling, it's shrinking again. So the bronze comes out a little smaller than the original. But in addition to that, you get some distortion, which you then have to try to, mitigate when you're fitting and welding the piece together. So the details, you do sometimes have to apply some details, but the hardest part really is all of that refitting and making things look like the form is correct and seamless. That's the most difficult part of that process. But yeah, it's hard work. Very skilled work.
Yeah, I mean, you've been very open about your process, especially doing like Instagram Live and stuff. And I remember sitting in my metal shop in school and just like watching on my phone, like this is insane. You mentioned how many people are working with you. Like, how many on average people work with you to create a piece from start to finish?
Yeah, that's a good question. That really varies, honestly. It depends on what's going on in terms of exhibitions, or if I have to produce something for a deadline. Currently, I only have one person working with me, but I've had up to 5 people working with me. But mostly it's like 1 or 2, like regular helping me. So I have an exhibition coming up in November in New York City. So at Mizell Gallery and Louis K. Mizell Gallery, and so I'm going to be like right now. I'm going to be like really going into production. So I'll have 2 people helping me make the molds, pull my waxes, do some wax chasing. I do all of the sculpting myself. Obviously, I do everything in the clay. I'm doing myself, but after that point, I have people helping with molds and casting waxes, and I do most of the welding on my pieces. But I do have somebody else help me with welding. But then I have assistants helping with the metal chasing. I prefer to do most of the patinas myself. I'm kind of clear about that. But otherwise, I have people helping me throughout that process. Otherwise, I would have no time to sculpt. I'd be doing bronze, pretty much 9 months out of the year. Yeah. So I do. Yeah, I'd say. I mean, on average, when I'm in full production, I have 2 or 3 people helping at any given point. So
talking a little bit about, you mentioned the Louis K. Mizell Gallery that you're represented by, and you told me in our conversations via email that kind of came about from your work with Audrey Black.
Correct.
Tell me a little bit about, I mean, just how you're showing your work progressed from getting represented, you said, back in 2003 by another gallery, and then switching to Mizell, and then until today.
Right. Yeah. Good question. That's So when I when I went to graduate school after undergrad, I ended up leaving grad school after the first year. But while I was there, I met Audrey Flack. She came into our studios, and I met her. And then approximately a year and a half later, she was working on a very big project that needed assistance, and I was hired as one of the assistants for her. And so I really worked as her assistant for a good 10 years. It was beyond me.
Mike felt like he needed to pay me because he was my boyfriend.
I don't know what happened. Are you hearing something in the background there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got something else came. Like, I don't know what happened. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know what happened there. Oh, I was getting another phone call. So,
Okay.
okay, you can hear me okay, right?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. So where I was with this, I uh, was working for Audrey Flack, and I worked for her for about 10 years, not full time, and there were various points at which I was working full time for her. But during that period, I really didn't do any of my own artwork. I was really working for about 5 years just on her work, gaining a lot of experience. I mean, it was invaluable. I learned a lot working for her. I also worked on a couple of other projects, the Leonardo da Vinci Horse project, which ended up in Milan.
Yeah.
There were a number of things that I did during that period that weren't related to my own artwork. So after about 5 or 6 years, then I really started getting into my own work, and almost immediately got into the John Pence Gallery in San Francisco. And I showed with John Pence for about 10 years. But during that period, I was still in touch with Audrey, and we were still in contact, even though I wasn't working for her. And I had a piece in New York at the New York Academy of Art, and Audrey told Lou that he should check it out. And so he and his wife Susan Mizell, they went to the show. They saw my piece, and that's how I ended up getting picked up by Lou. So I think that the lesson for this for younger artists is that it's so much of what you do in the art world is through connections, right? It's about who people you meet, and trying to cultivate relationships and those kinds of friendships, and it's really important. It's a social world, and you have to be social. I know it's hard for an artist because we don't like to be social. We like to go into our studios and work. We don't like to, I mean, I know a lot of artists, including myself. Sometimes we don't like to talk about our work. We like to, we're fairly private people often. But openings can be kind of awkward and so forth. But it's really, really important. It's been the way in which my career has developed, and so that connection with Audrey was a key one, leading up to being represented by Mizell Gallery.
Yeah.
But I mean, I hope that answers your question. I mean, I gave you the really condensed version of it. Simply because there are a lot of details in there, including, I was a professor for 10 years in there, and my career has had a lot of like overlapping layers to it, and that's very typical, I think, of most artists today. It's very rare for artists just to be working artists and making money at that. Most artists have overlapping elements to what they do. So.
Just a side note before we move on, I think you started sharing your screen with me.
Oh, I did? Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Should we? I don't know how we did that.
If you click those two overlapping squares down at the bottom.
I got it.
Yep. There you go.
That's better, right? Now it's just of me. You don't see my incoming text that I'm getting.
No.
Sorry about that. I mean, I'm getting all these incoming texts.
It's all good.
I mean, sorry about that.
No
Okay, so now you're just seeing me, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So you mentioned a little bit your teaching, and you teach at a university as well as independent workshops, right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, no, I no longer teach at a university. I quit that about 4 years ago, and lately I've just been doing workshops. I do workshops in various places. Start doing workshops here in my new studio. Primarily, I've been doing workshops in Rome every summer. That's my main thing that I do for workshops. But I also travel and do some different parts of the country and different parts of the world, like South Africa. I'll be going to Brazil and doing a workshop. But I got out of academia about 4 years ago, primarily because it was just it was a real distraction from trying to get my work done.
Yeah.
But I love workshops because people who go to workshops tend to be like really engaged in what they're doing. They oftentimes travel a long way. They are coming for a very specific reason. They're very highly motivated, You know, they're not taking your class because they have to fill an elective, you know, or something like that.
Yeah.
So everybody's very engaged, and I really enjoy it. So that's probably what I'll continue doing for a while.
Yeah, and are these workshops like professional artists who are coming to work with you, or just kind of anybody? Like, what's the clientele like for that?
All different kinds, You know, like everything from professional artists to uh, um, you know, people who are just beginning, college students, people who have just want to, you know, just who, you know, kind of do it on the side. Yeah, all different kinds. I mean, I've had people in workshops from age 16 to 75. So I mean, I would say average is probably in their 30s, and people who have other careers but want to transition into doing more of their own artwork. That's probably the most common person that takes a workshop with me. But again, I actually like the fact that there's a wide variety, that you're not getting one demographic. You have it really is helpful for people of all those different backgrounds to see that they have a shared interest in something, and that common interest has nothing to do with where they're from or, you know, what their background is. You know, it really makes it a dynamic environment and creates a nice social dynamic that's really engaging. I enjoy that a lot. So the social part of it is a big thing for me. It's not just the education; it's the chance to meet people from various parts of the world who have different backgrounds. It's really great.
And have you found the teaching process to ever become collaborative at all? I've been talking to a lot of people who teach recently, and more and more I've been hearing about how the teaching process is a learning experience for the teacher as well, and can often become a sort of collaborative experience.
Oh yeah, you know that's actually a really great question. Now that has to do a little bit with everybody has a different like pedagogical theory, right, or a different way of approaching it. Everybody has a different thought process for that, or a different methodology. But for me, it's always been that way. I mean, when I first started teaching when I was first a professor at Lime Academy College of Fine Arts years ago, like from the very beginning, that was my approach. It was very much, you know, obviously people are they're taking a class with me for a particular set of skills that I have to impart, or at least my approach to looking and thinking about art making. And so obviously they want me to impart that. But I also think it's really, you know, what happened to me was when I started teaching, I found that my work got significantly better because in addition to having to articulate to other people my thought process and make it clear and understandable and digestible to them, I also had to start to integrate that they had a different way of thinking about what it meant to be a creative person, right? So in other words, I never here's another way of saying it. I never took the approach and never will take the approach that I want people to be clones of me in the way right? That's just that to me makes no sense. Like that, you know, I would never want to impose that, nor would I want to encourage it from anyone. So for me, it was always very important that there was an interaction and trying to understand the student or participant's point of view, so that I could best direct their own thinking, right? And say, you know, my approach can be useful to maybe a different degree for each person, but in the act of interacting, you know, I kind of have to be forced to rethink some of my own assumptions, right? And because we all have them, and the more you work, the more used to your own system of thinking that you get, and so you have to find ways to you know, rethink what you're doing so that you stay fresh. And teaching is a great way to do that if you're open as a teacher to thinking of it that way. And so I agree with that point of view, and I found that to be true for myself. And that's one of the reasons I love doing it. Because people will always surprise you. You know, there'll always be some new way of thinking, and it doesn't necessarily mean that my work will change radically from the process of teaching a class. But you know, there's small shifts along happen because everyone has a unique intellectual path. And
Mhm.
so yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would call that collaborative as much as I would say it's interactive.
Yeah.
Because each person's, collaboration would connotes the idea that you're working toward a singular goal together. And I'd say that's more interactive, where, you have lots of people on their own path, and those various paths can kind of intersect and influence each other and create, a positive effect for everyone, including the teacher.
Yeah.
So, but that's I agree with that thought process. And obviously it varies from course to course and from student to student. But I'm always open to those those kinds of interactions, because I think they're vital to keeping you fresh and alive as an artist today.
Mhm.
So, because we live in such a diverse world, we're not.
Yeah.
That's we don't live in a monoculture. We don't live in a we live in a very uh, heterogeneous culture that has lots of different influences from that come from different cultures, different sources, and so I think to be contemporary, you really have to be sort of in tune with all of that, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to cater to whatever comes along, but I think it's if you're an honest thinker, that's probably an important thing to consider, right?
Talking about that, or going off of one of the last things you said, being contemporary and being an honest thinker, how has your thought process and how you go about creating things imagery wise progressed throughout your career and leading up to now? Because in a lot of ways, your work is very classically driven, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a big topic, right?
Yeah.
Because classically, I mean, I think it's really important with a lot of representational artists to sort of to begin with definitions,
Mhm.
Because there are a lot of terms that are thrown out,
Yeah.
and they become kind of interchangeable, but they're not really. So
Yeah.
for example, like realism versus classical, or veristic versus representational, right? So I would say, I mean, the way I would define it is that my work is highly representational.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't, I understand the use of the word classical because it's a common term, which is often used, but I would say that classical is probably not the most precise term to use, because it connotes the idea of something that follows a particular canon, right? So that's one of the things about classical art, that classical meaning from a particular time period, with a set of canonical proportions and forms, right?
Yeah.
Whereas my work, I really do try to think of particular individuals when I'm working. So it's probably much more based in a 19th century naturalistic approach.
Yeah.
But I'm also heavily influenced by um, by 21st century hyper realistic work, which has an attention to detail
Yeah.
that I don't necessarily apply to my work, but I think it's very interesting because of the way in which a contemporary viewer sees the body, right? And
Yeah.
so all of these things are sort of intertwining to create whatever I do, whether it's an influence of classicism or 19th century realism, or late 20th, early 21st century hyperrealism. These are all interesting definitions. So yeah, my work has changed in this regard.
Yeah.
So I think the earlier pieces were much more heavily influenced by a kind of Renaissance approach to making forms. Okay, and what I mean by that is they even though I was, so for example, I did a lot of self portraits, and even though I was using myself as a reference, my form sense and my sense of structure was very much influenced by a Renaissance approach, which was highly structural and rational, right? And so so I was sort of synthesizing those two things, both looking at myself as a particular example for making the sculpture, but also creating forms that had that Renaissance kind of rationalism to them, right?
Yeah.
But now I think my work has shifted much more toward the other, because I'm doing a lot of female figures that are very particular, that are meant to look like a contemporary female body and not a classical body. A classical body, would have certain canon of proportions and so forth. So yeah, my thinking has changed in that way. Like, I think that I was probably in my earlier part of my representational work, I was looking a lot more at canonical proportional things, structural approaches to making things that was highly influenced by Renaissance anatomical approaches. And I don't do that anymore. Now it's primarily looking straight at a model and trying to figure out what their particular gestures and postures and that sort of I'm looking more for the syntax of the body in a particular person. So yeah, that's how it's changed, and I think it will continue to go in that direction. Actually, I think it'll continue to become much more of a much more based on an observational system rather than using any kind of canons or structural approach, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? I mean, that
that was great.
I don't know if I talked so long, I can't remember the original question.
No, it's totally okay. So I think we've covered a lot of awesome stuff, and we're reaching about that time limit where I don't like to strain the viewers to have to go through our conversation for too long. So to wrap up, I'm going to let you tell everyone where they can find you. I know you mentioned a show coming up, the Mizell Gallery. You actually posted on Instagram today about a show, work you have in Taiwan. So yeah, tell us about what you got going on, what's coming up.
Yeah. So that show in Taiwan will be up for a few months, and it's a group show at a museum in the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, is what it's called. And that's a group show of hyper-realist sculpture from the last 50 years, hyper-realist sculpture from the last 50 years. So it's a great show because it includes a lot of different artists from doing representational sculpture in different genres and materials. And so anything from Dwayne Hansen and Ron Mueck kind of hyper-realism to myself and Robert Graham. And it's just a lot of, people can look it up, but because the list is pretty large of artists that are in that show. So I'm very fortunate to have a piece in there. And then I have a solo show coming up in the fall at Mizell Gallery, opening November 7th. And that will include some new works. Everything that's going to be in there is something that hasn't been in a solo show that I've had before, but it'll be some brand new works in there as well, all in bronze. And that will that's actually going to go into December a bit as well. So it'll go up to Christmas, so people can see it. Hopefully, people can come to the opening and get to meet some folks. But those are the main things I have going right now. I'll probably have some pieces in some art fairs, but I'm not. Those are obviously coming and going. I don't really have details about that at the moment. And what else? I have, like I said, I have a workshop that I'll be doing in December in Brazil. I'll be doing a workshop in my studio here in Pennsylvania in November, and then in next May I'll be doing a workshop in Rome. So you can see it's a busy schedule.
Quite the schedule.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, and we thank you so much for coming on and talking with us.